Everyone, this is Commander Val from the Challenger Learning Center of Northwest Indiana. Everybody at Challenger hopes that you all are staying safe and healthy at home. I'm here today to do with you a science experiment that you can do at home with some of the materials you already have at home. We're going to be focused on the concept of density, and we're going to be following some really great scientific procedures as we do that. If you would like to follow along at home or do this experiment on your own, you can print out this lab sheet that we have on our Facebook page, available to anybody that wants to use it. You don't have to, but I think it's a pretty good guide of doing the experiment. Density is about how much mass is contained in a certain volume. Okay, think of it as how much stuff is packed into a given space and how tightly packed that stuff is. The more dense something is, the more tightly packed that material is. All right, so here's the materials you're going to need. Okay, you do need a clear container, such as like a drinking glass like this. It just has to be clear. That's one of the most important things you need today. You also need different objects or different liquids that you're going to be testing the densities of. Okay, that includes cooking oil. Okay, got dish soap. All basically stuff you can find around your house. I've got maple syrup, pancake syrup. I have water here that I already put some blue food coloring in because it'll be easier to see the water if it has a food coloring in it. And I also have some milk that I already just poured out of the gallon container into this little cup. All right, and speaking of this cup, you can use a measuring cup to measure out the same amount of each liquid if you wish. I'm just going to eyeball it for today and try to get about the same amount of each material, but you could measure it out and have little cups ready with each material if you'd like to do that. It's up to you. Now remember that this is a science experiment, so when we're doing science experiments, we don't taste, we don't put things too close to our faces, even though a lot of this stuff like the syrup or the milk is something that you would eat or drink on a regular basis. We're not going to do that during the science experiment. We're going to avoid doing any kind of tasting today, and we're going to keep everything away from our face. So like we said before, this experiment is all about density and how each of the different liquids is going to fall in the same container. That's how we're going to see the differences in density. You might hear this experiment being referred to as a density tower, because once we have all the different liquids in here, they're going to arrange themselves in a little tower like this. Okay, so I have all my materials here, and if you have your guide sheet, what I'd like you to do next is just make some observations about the different materials you're working with today. There's a chart here on the first page where you can document all of the observations about them. What do you observe about them? What do you notice about how they move in their container? Like I can tell that, something like the syrup kind of moves slowly when I move the container, whereas the oil seems a lot lighter and it moves a lot more easily within the container. Things like that, maybe just even the colors is a good observation for you to write down. So observe your material, think about how it looks inside the container, think about how it moves around, and record some observations on your guide sheet. Another good scientific step would be to make a prediction. And I have a sheet here, the second page of your lab sheet here is about making a prediction about how these different liquids will compare with density. Now, as we put the liquids into our clear container, they're going to arrange themselves with the most dense liquid at the bottom to the least dense liquid at the very top. So I want you guys to predict which materials do you think are more dense than the others? Which ones seem heavier? Which ones do you predict are going to sink to the bottom? So your most dense one you're going to write here, and then you're going to go in order up to the least dense. Which one do you think is going to end up floating at the very top? And then you could even draw a little picture of how they're going to look when they're stacked up, just as your prediction. Okay, it's like a hypothesis, an educated guess on what is going to happen. I'm going to put mine in order for you of what I predict based on my observations. All right, so I'm pretty sure, I believe that the syrup is going to be the most dense. So I'm going to put that as my first, my most dense object. Okay, now next up, I'm pretty sure I think these two are the lightest, the water and the oil. So I'm going to think about the milk and the dish soap and how I want to compare these. So I'm going to go with the milk as being a little more dense. And then I'm going to follow it by the dish soap. And then between these last two, I'm going to put my water and my oil. So that's my prediction from most dense to least dense. So now that we've made our predictions, we're going to carefully put about the same amount of each liquid into your clear container. Okay, like I said, I'm not really measuring them out, but I'm just trying to use about the same amount so that it's easiest to see. Now I had predicted that the syrup was going to be the most dense. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in first. Okay, I'm not going to go crazy and put too much of it. You know, you don't want to waste all your family's materials here. You might actually want to enjoy some pancakes later, so don't use up all your syrup. I think that's a pretty good amount, maybe a little bit more. And I'll try to use this as a baseline for how much I end up using with each of the other liquids. So that's about, all right, there's my syrup. Now this isn't going to tell me a whole lot yet because I haven't put anything else in there. There's nothing to compare it to. Now I had predicted next that the milk was going to be the next most dense material. Okay, so when I pour it in, I want to be really careful, and I also might make some observations along the way. At the bottom of your second page of your lab sheet, there's a spot for you guys to write down any observations or anything you notice about what's happening as you pour in the different liquids. So I'm going to slowly pour in my milk. I'm not going to just dump it. Okay, I want to slowly pour it in, and I want to watch what happens. So I'll hold it up so you guys can see what happens as I put it in. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but this will encourage you to try it at home. All right, so I got all my milk in there. I noticed pretty quickly that it really doesn't mix with it. You can see the milk clearly resting on top of the syrup. Okay, so maybe I can write that in my observations, you know, that the milk really doesn't mix at all, just immediately goes right to the top. It didn't like just stay on the top. It was when I put it in, it slowly made its way up. So I definitely can tell that my predictions were correct as far as these two go, that the syrup is definitely more dense than the milk. All right, very good. So now before I add another material, I think it's best to wait a little bit. I've already waited a little while. I would wait at least 20 to 30 seconds in between adding each item. And that gives you enough time to write down any of your observations anyway. So we've written our observations, we've given this time to settle. Now the next thing I predicted, the next one I thought was going to be the dish soap. All right, so now, same as before, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to add in my dish soap, and I'm going to see what happens. All right, so making observations, okay. All right, that orange was definitely easy to see. And while it looks like it's mixing a little bit with the milk, it does seem like that dish soap is hanging out on top of the milk. Looks like it definitely floated to the top, which means it is less dense than the other two items. So I definitely have 3 clear layers here. We want to write down any observations we made about our dish soap and how it mixed in or didn't mix in and what ended up happening when we added it. So this is great. So far my predictions have been correct. I have 3 distinct layers of liquids, and I have written some observations down. Okay, now enough time has passed. These have definitely settled enough that I can add my next item. Now my last 2 items were going to be the oil and the water, and I predicted that the water was going to be a little more dense than the oil. Now I've colored it blue so it would be easy to see. Let's see what happens when I add the water slowly and carefully. All right, it's kind of staining the milk a little bit, it looks like. See what happens. This one is a little bit different than the last couple times, so let's observe a little bit. Okay, I definitely see that it's above the milk. I definitely think it's above the milk, but we're going to have to wait and see a little bit on how it's going to compare with the dish soap and the water. All right, right now they look like they're kind of mixed up with each other, kind of working out where it wants to go. So I might write that on my observations, like it wasn't as clear at the beginning, wasn't as obvious where the water was. Now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that there's definitely some water above that dish soap. Okay, so I think my predictions are correct, but this might be something that later on, after it settles, I can get a better idea of how everything is separated. All right, so I would write that down in my observations. You never know what's going to happen. And adding the blue water definitely changed the look of my density tower a little bit. So observations, and I only have one thing left to add, and that's the cooking oil. Now, I had predicted originally that this oil was going to be the lightest out of all of the liquids. So we're going to try that out and see what happens. I'm just getting a better look at my tower. I'm going to pour in some oil. All right, let's see what happens there. Okay, if you look closely at it, okay, it kind of looks like to me that oil settled at the very top. You can kind of see that it's a little easier to see through than that blue food coloring that I had in the water earlier. That oil is definitely settled on the top of my glass. So I was right that was the least dense. It's a little shaky about that dish soap and the water from earlier, but I could definitely tell that cooking oil is the least dense, and it floated right at the top. So I can write my observations down there on what happened when I put the oil in and how it changed any of the liquids and what it did. So let's talk about what happened here. Okay, what does your density tower look like? What did you do with your prediction? How did you do with your predictions? And on page 3 of your lab sheet, you can actually draw another picture of how it turned out and the definite order of your different liquids. So that's our wrap up there. So what happened here? Okay, the liquids definitely separate because they have different densities. Okay, the more dense liquids that had the tightly packed in material, they sunk to the bottom, and the lighter, less dense materials that were less packed in, they floated to the top, and we create a lot of distinct layers here. Got a little fuzzy with that blue, the dish soap and the water, but I can still see here that I've got the maple syrup at the bottom and that line of milk there. Okay, so I can definitely tell that, and then the oil at the top. So we also have seen that our density tower may or may not have done a good job of going with what our predictions originally told us. So there's other fun things you can do with this experiment. Once you've finished with this, we can try dropping different items inside to see what they do, see how their density affects where they fall in the glass. You can also try different materials. You can try different liquids that you might have around your house. Of course, though, ask your parents first. Make sure that they are okay with what you decide to use and that it's safe for you to use. And we didn't measure densities today. Like, we didn't give number values of what the mass divided by the volume was going to be. One other thing you can do is you can go online and research those actual density values for these common materials and see if the values match up with what you actually found. Like if the density of maple syrup is really that much higher than the density of the cooking oil. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that experiment. As you can see, there's a lot of different things you can do with it, a lot of different ways you can play around with it. And we'd love to see any photos you have of how you did your experiment and what your results were. So again, thank you so much for watching. We at Challenger all wish you lots of safety and health, and we want you to stay safe, but we also want you to stay curious. Thanks.